Paul Tarsey and Jim Roller from the Historic Racing News Team recently had a grand day out in Dun, Scotland, including a visit to the Jim Clark Museum. Here are some of the highlights.
In the context, people wonder maybe if you know Jim Clark's story at all, that Chirnside, the village associated with him, which is about 10 miles, probably less actually, 8 miles east of us. The room was set up here because back before 1975 in Scotland we still had the town councils, the borough councils, and this was the chambers and offices of Dun's Town Council. And in 1969, when all Jim's trophies from his house and his mum and dad's house were brought together, they were put into the borough chambers. They employed someone to sit behind the desk, let people in, and so that's how this came about. And when we came to do the massive rebuild in 2018-19, upstairs were still filing cabinets full of reports about farm pest outbreaks and posters on the wall of all the different kind of insects you got. And in 2018, money from the lottery, the council, just shy of £2 million, was able to fund our rebuild to turn it into the big museum we're going to see now. Let's get out the rain. Jim, by birth, is not actually a borderer. He's not actually a Berwickshire man. He's from Fife. And the family lived up a little place called Kilmany. So for those of you that know the geography, very northeast corner of Fife, almost towards Taybridge, St Andrews, so up in the rural part, up in the northeast corner. He was the youngest of 5, all older sisters. It must have been a nightmare getting to the bathroom in the morning and school or whatever. But so the family moved when he was only 5 or 6. From Fife down to a little farm called Edington Mains, which is just beyond Chirnside, so it would be about 10 miles from us here. My cousin Billy Potts, in fact, who just only died a few months ago, we did a little bit of amateur rallying, and Jim did on occasion map read for him as the navigator. And so technically speaking, the first racing trophy that Jim ever won was this number 1 here for the Hunter Cup in 1955, just a local road rally. We've got the map measurer that he used there, the little box that it came in for his name on it. However, unfortunately, Jim wasn't actually that good at reading maps. And as a result, after we think about 3 events, despite having finished the top 3 or whatever it was to get that trophy, his cousin basically sacked him and got someone else who was a bit better at map reading. In the mid-50s, he joined a young farmers club at Ednam, so again, very close to where you'd have been this morning, just outside Kelso. And he became particular friends with another member of that club, a guy called Ian Scott Watson. So Ian lived up in the northern part of Berwickshire toward Stow and Lauder, and Ian had a bit of money behind him, and Ian had a great love of cars, and Ian went motor racing on his weekends. So he would buy second-hand sports cars and tag his pals along to be mechanics and other drivers and so on, and they would just see how they did. He kind of jokingly called the team Mercury Agricole, the farmers team. And we don't have it on the board here, but there's a nice line-up picture they have of sort of their various cars. Which at that point Jim's driving a Sunbeam Talbot that belonged to his father, so not a particularly, but got a bit of oomph behind it, but not a particularly sporty machine. The legend goes that on the day Ian said to Jim, "There's 3 or 4 heats today, Jim. Why don't you have a go in one of them and just see how you get on?" Last year someone came in with a race programme from that event, and interestingly, for one of the heats it has an entry in the Zondra class as I.S. Watson or J. Clark Jr. So there was obviously actually a little bit more premeditation to it than the legend has, but it clearly wasn't by any means settled. And Jim lined up. We have a photograph of the start grid. He's in the last position of the grid. And the legend that you will find, particularly on the internet in some places, is that Jim won his first ever race, which is not true. He finished last. But the point is that his time in his heat was almost as good as Ian's in the couple of heats that Ian did. And Ian had obviously been racing for a couple of years, as many weekends as he could. So him and his mates realised that actually Jim had a bit of talent here that no one had really realised. We actually chose this picture very deliberately because the caricature image of Jim is as the racing shepherd with sheep and so on. The farm actually had far more cattle than it ever had sheep. And this was our kind of little subtle attempt to right that balance a wee bit, because the family always say, yeah, there were really many sheep around actually, but it was kind of more photogenic, I suppose, for Jim to be the racing shepherd, the flying Scotsman with the crook, etc., rather than the cattle farmer. The question was, would he then look for opportunities to turn as a professional driver, or he would just be content to carry on as he was? Because as he says himself, he was perfectly happy on the farm, going racing on the weekends. His mum wasn't very impressed by the whole idea of being a racing driver. She thought it was a bit dangerous, and his dad thought it would turn out to be expensive. So he wasn't getting a kind of big push from the family. But what team was it he joined initially? It's obviously a trick question because the answer isn't Lotus. No, it was Aston Martin. So Aston Martin were coming back into Formula One after, I think, quite a number of years out. They clearly didn't have a huge amount of resource to do this, so they weren't going out to attract in established F1 drivers. They looked around Britain and tried to find 3 kind of up-and-coming guys who they could get in. And so Jim, well, at that point, he'd only had a single-seater event. That was that Boxing Day thing. But he'd obviously shown himself as an adaptable sports car driver. And so he was signed up to be part of this fledgling team. They never actually competed in a Formula One race. However, he had good fortune in that he'd also joined up to race in Formula Junior that season in a Lotus 18, which was actually being used across the categories at that point. You could use it in Formula One, some F2 races, and in Formula Junior. And so in the opening months of the season, he was doing very well. By good fortune for him was the season that John Surtees was coming into Formula One from motorbikes. And John Surtees was still doing the switch that year. So some weekends he was away at a motorbike event and he had to miss the Formula One race or the Formula 2 race or something. And Lotus were looking for someone to fill in, because if you've got a car sitting there, it'd be well somebody use it. And they said, Jim Clark. We know this guy. Obviously Colin Chapman's ears pricked up, he was aware of that name. And so from the late spring onwards, when John Surtees was away, Jim would get to race the Formula One cars, kind of number 3, and there was 3 in a team in those days. And in fact, by the end of the season, he'd done well enough that he got bumped up the pecking order and he was signed up as a full-blown member of the team. And so he wins the championship in '63, 100% points.
Wow.
Now, admittedly, you could drop your worst 2 races in those days, so you didn't have to win every race, but near enough. That was obviously fantastic. And to mark being Formula One World Champion, the FIA gave him this rather modest trophy. And the black base isn't with it, by the way. We gave it that because it looked silly otherwise. The first Scot ever to win the Formula One World Championship, only the 3rd Briton after Hawthorne and Hill. Youngest ever to do it at that time as well. In fact, there's only been a handful younger since. And then '65, which of course we're celebrating the 60th anniversary of this year, it all comes together in a way that, it's his great season, and we like to say the greatest season collectively any driver has ever driven. So Jim wins the Formula One again, and he gets an ever so slightly more elaborate trophy than he did 2 years before. And the wood is contemporary this time, so the FIA have obviously got a little bit more money. So he wins the Formula One World Championship again, 100% points again. But he doesn't just win that, he wins the British Formula 2 Championship, and he wins the French Formula 2 Championship, and he wins the Tasman Series, which opened the season in January, February. He tries to defend his British Saloon Car title, and when he's able to contest the races, he usually wins, but he unfortunately has to miss too many because of races abroad. So he doesn't retain the Saloon Car Championship. He's doing a few things in the sports cars. So he's got British Formula 2, French Formula 2, Tasman Series, the Formula 1 World Championship, and he wins the Indy 500. This is the...
And
the Americans, you're talking about money earlier on, he became a well-off man by our standards from Formula 1 sports cars, etc. But not what we'd call a millionaire. He became what we'd think of as a millionaire from winning in America. That's where the big money was. So he wins the Indy 500, first non-American for half a century, first ever in a rear engine car, first ever to average 150 miles an hour, and he's still today the only man in history to win Formula One and Indy 500 in the same year. Jim was not someone who courted the limelight. He was a quiet, shy, reserved man. In fact, one of his cousins and one of his nephews that are still alive that were not too much younger than him talk about the fact that today you'd probably say that he was introverted. He was just very, very quiet, shy, wanted to be back home. And he would come straight back to the farm after races, if he had a few weeks off at some point, which he didn't often get. They raced so intensively in those days. And for example, after he becomes world champion in '63, literally the next week, he is at the Kelso Ram sales. And it's not for show, He was there all day long selling the stock because that was his job. The last part of the museum tells the story, of course, that we have to, which is that it's all a celebration of Jim's life, but of course we have to tell the story of his death. A whole load of legends spring up about this event. It is true that the car had been repaired from a bad shunt. It is true that Jim never really needed to be there. They had a sports car race at Brands Hatch and this event at Hockenheim, and they basically split the team, and Jim and Graham Hill went to Hockenheim and other drivers went to Brands Hatch, so he could have been in their place. It was a kind of toss-up really where they wanted to go. There's 2 heats, 20 laps each. A few laps into the first heat, just the ticket and the programme, etc. from the race there. Something happens on the outer part of the circuit. Jim's car leaves the track and goes into the trees. And Formula 1, Formula 2, etc. The safety as it was in those days, there's no gravel trap, runoff barriers, nothing. There's just a few metres of grass and then the forest. And we don't know what caused the thing to happen. The general explanations are he had a puncture, or the suspension failed, or they had trouble with the fuel pump cutting in and out, so possibly it cut out as he was into the bend, and he maybe kind of lost position ever so slightly, and it cut in again and the power came back on through him. But whatever the reason was, the car left the track into the trees about 150 miles an hour. And so there was no surviving that. And last up, of course, we have what for most of our visitors is probably the most likely Jim Clark type car they would have maybe had themselves, is of course the Lotus Cortina. So someone was asking me when you were gathering at the start, we've had 2 of these. The one we had for a couple of years was from his '64 season, when he had won the Saloon Car Championship. That belonged to Dario Franchitti, the Scots-Italian IndyCar champion, for whom Jim's kind of his great hero. In fact, it's said that Dario's collection is second only to the museum's in terms of memorabilia and so on.
For more information, or if you want to plan a visit to the museum, go to jimclarktrust.com. And you can hear more from Kenny McLean about the legend who was Jim Clark on the November episode of Historic Racing News. Also, Paul Jerd will recall the greatest year any Grand Prix driver ever had. That was Jim Clark in 1965. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts, including right here on our YouTube channel, HRN Chronicles. Historic Racing News. It's where motorsports history lives.